if you want to have democracy in a local community, can you do it if the economic rug is pulled out from under the citizens of the community day by day? Obviously you can't. In Cleveland, it went from 800,000 to about 390,000 in the last numbers. That means the disintegration of a whole fabric of a society. You need also to begin stabilizing the basis of a community if you're interested in long-term projections of democracy. So I'm laying out these very hard, sketchy problems, and I want to come back to, again, practically speaking, what we're working with now are models that begin to point towards solutions, maybe. But if we want to step up to the plate, we are going to actually have to ask ourselves these kinds of questions and begin to find ways to communicate them to other people. Now, fortunately, this kind of thing happens all the time in world history. That is to say, the most difficult of all the cultural revolutions that have happened in the United States, the most challenging to power structures, the most threatening to half of the society, was the feminist revolution. We take it for granted now. But it was a root and branch destruction of patterns that have been living in the United States and world history for centuries. And in 30, 40 years, a major shift in the way people related took place. And so similarly with the civil rights movement. I think this is the most interesting time in world history and in American history, bar none. I think we're coming up to the limits of the system. And the sense of people in this room that there's something that needs to be done is one thing. The sense of most Americans that something is profoundly wrong is also really critical. That's a big deal when there is a sense in the society that the old ways just don't work. That can lead in many different directions. It can lead to the right, it can lead to populism, violence, etc. But it is a forcing ground. It is the forcing ground, maybe the only forcing ground, when people realize something profoundly wrong is going on. That people begin to ask deeper questions of the kind we're talking about. So I take that as a positive sign as well as a negative, that more and more people, I think, will be asking the kinds of questions. And one of the things they'll be asking is there anything we can do here locally that can either solve a local problem, often out of desperation, or for many, and many younger people, and we're beginning to see this, is there anything I can do that might suggest a positive way forward for the larger society? That's also happening. Younger people in particular are beginning to respond and look for positive things. Throughout the environmental movement, you see it on the ground. And what's interesting is the projects are very interesting. Many kinds of projects, in the food side, and the environmental, in the community building side, and the institution building side, land trust, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But what's more important is the attitude, the energy, something to do, people beginning to react. And again, if I hadn't expected to talk about this, but to me, that particular change, the energy switch, that's what's interesting about this time, because when that happens, broad things potentially happen. I think I was mentioning somebody, I was at Harvard in the Institute of Politics during the Vietnam War, and I have this fantastic memory of the time along the banks of the Charles. Those of you know that part of it. In the spring of maybe 68 or 67, I think it was. You go out on the banks of the Charles, and the kids were doing frisbees and flirting and enjoying the sun. And the place was wonderful. And then one day, nobody was there. They all, suddenly the switch turned and they were all involved in the anti-war movement. They just disappeared. And that the remarkable moment when, as in Egypt, when there's a flip. So you can't bet on that, but I do think we have that possibility as well. One more piece about that, and I won't go down this track much more. I'm from Wisconsin. Joe McCarthy was from Wisconsin. And in Wisconsin, McCarthyism was rampant. They shot anything that moved politically. So if you believed in the 1950s, I guess, that change was possible in Wisconsin, they were crazy. And then, of course, the 60s exploded. So I offer that to you as a reminder. Don't take seriously the thought that nothing can change. It might. No, it might not as well. I want to say a bit more about the models that we're talking about. and make them a little nastier still. If we're talking about growth questions and a system that does not have to grow, and most businesses in this country have to grow in a capitalist market. There's pressure to grow for financial reasons. But if you were designing a system that did not have to grow, one of the conditions you'd have to have is that there was a sufficiently sustainable market that the industry or the business could resist pressures to grow rampantly and take somebody else's market. Now, that's the problem with the various models that depend upon growth in many communities. Do you take the market from the other guy's community and destabilize that community? The anchor institution possibility provides a partial stabilizer of the market. So it is a partial answer to the growth problem by undercutting some of the pressures that produce necessary growth in markets that are not sheltered of that kind. We will have to see, as people develop further the models that we're looking at, whether or not it is a sufficiently powerful model to begin giving us a real answer to that question. I think it may or may not be at that time. Another question I think I want to put on the table is, again, we're trying to change not only distribution of wealth at the top, but distribution in different communities. The policies of most development in many communities now essentially involve bringing in development if you can get it, gentrifying the area if you can achieve it, and just throwing the people out if they can find a place to go. Successful economic development means get rid of the people, the poor people, and largely black people in many communities. That's a successful model. The model that is democratic and egalitarian and hopefully sustainable is one that begins with a very different principle. How do we stabilize and work with the people here and try to transform that possibility? And again, we see it not simply as a model in one community, but whether or not the principles offer us ways to generalize the models. Do they offer us a handle on larger systems and other communities? Not only other communities. Many of my friends in the environmental movement are enamored with small is beautiful. And so am I. And the Great Schumacher book is a wonderful book. And there are many, many projects that we're very interested in that are very small scale. But I urge you to read part 4 of Small is Beautiful again. Schumacher, the great gospel and the great preacher of all this, understood fully that you had to deal with large scale when large scale was important. And he was interested in the principles, when necessary, that can be generalized to larger systems. So a big task, I think, and the task that we haven't addressed properly has to do with large scale finance, transportation, big industry. 30% of American employment is in companies over 10,000. But that's not small is beautiful. And you may be able to break them down in some ways, but what do you do about problems of scale? I'm laying that out as challenges that have to begin with principles of the kind we're talking about, but have to be thought about by those of us who care about these matters in terms of what are the implications, what shadow intellectually, politically, and principle might they begin to structure for longer term change. If I say one last thing, don't trust me. But one related principle that I want to toss on the table is this. We are talking about politics. There is a part of our movement that would like only to deal with institutions and businesses and development. And that's absolutely necessary. That's what we spend most of our time at in terms of the Democracy Collaborative and the projects that we're working on. But ultimately, what we are inevitably talking about is institutional change that will have to take a politics with it. Hopefully an inspiring politics, hopefully a democratic politics, hopefully a sustainable politics, but it will require addressing who makes decisions at some point in the system as a whole, and whether those decisions can be made in a democratic way. That is brutal, particularly in parts of our environmental movement, to get to that question. So the issues that are defined in these models, and some of the policy principles that flow from them, and some of the arguments and logic that they suggest, ultimately are in fact necessary principles to begin to sort out, both in terms of politics and the nature of a democratic decision-making process that could actually make the decisions that have to be made, and how the capital is allocated, and how the decisions are stabilized for communities, and who actually makes those decisions. And if we don't think about that, I can guarantee you there are other people who are thinking about it, and they know how to control the decisions very well. So I'm urging, what used to be called in the 60s a heavy wrap. I'm suggesting that the principles that seem to be involved in the kinds of discussions we're going to have tomorrow, in the many things that we have, and the examples that Jeffrey's talked about, and what we're going to hear from Ted and the green and the work that's being done, they ultimately are not simply interesting models to be replicated. They are questions that raise the most profound issues any society ever faces. They go to the heart of who controls decisions, how income and wealth are allocated, whether the system is sustainable at all, and whether or not people like us actually can act as citizens to make the decisions that matter for the society. So I want to urge us really to rise to that occasion. I didn't plan to give a preachment of this kind. I was going to talk a little bit more about the mechanics of the kinds of models we've been looking at. But I think that what I've heard so far and in the discussions we've had earlier, and John's remarks particularly, and Jeffrey, I think that's what we have implicitly here. And that's what governs and drives the work when we get down to nitty-gritty. And I think we need to acknowledge that. And by acknowledging it to ourselves and others, I think there is an empowerment in it to understand in a different way, existentially, who the people that you are living with in this room really are. You wouldn't be here otherwise. And the existential announcement to yourself and to ourselves that that's what it's all about, I think empowers us in a way that we need to face and understand directly. I just would urge that we keep the larger principles and framework in mind as to what this all means and why we're doing it, and what are the concrete, not airy-fairy, but real implications for democracy and sustainability that are implicit in these kinds of models that we're working with.